So we're going to have Pablo, and then after him, we will also have Adrian Flores. He is a climate finance associate from the NDC partnership. He is going to present the guide for the planning and mobilization of investments of NDCs. Adrian leads the implementation of knowledge activities and learning activities in the framework of implementing the financial strategy of NDC partnership. Adrian is responsible for establishing connections with partners from banks, multilateral organizations, donors, private sector organizations to foster participation and mobilization of finances with the aim of building coalitions that will boost climate actions and NDC partnership members. He has a postgrad degree in environmental sciences and geography, and he has experience in climate change in the Latin American region in organizations such as GIZ, ECLAC, IDB, and SICA. And now we will have, later we'll have Adrian, and now I'm going to present the panelists. Among the panelists, we have three panelists that will be. We have Aldo Malpartida, main official in infrastructure and energy from IDB Invest. Aldo, as I mentioned before, is responsible for creating and structuring investments in energy, transportation, sanitation, and social infrastructure in Andean countries. Between 2015 and 2018, he was the director of a corporate debt for BBVA Bank, and before he worked at IFC for 12 years, structuring debts and medicine investments, as well as energy capital for Latin America, Asia, and Eastern Europe. He studied in the Universidad del Pacífico, and he has a master's degree from NYU. The bios, they are huge. And we also have Margarita Gutierrez. She can also come here. Margarita Gutierrez is an engineer, and she has a master's degree in environmental engineering from Los Andes University in Colombia. He is a specialist in public policy from Sao Paulo, Madrid University. She has more than 20 years of experience in climate change and management of resources. She has worked on the 8 years for the hydrology event and environmental studies in Colombia. This is an institution that's in charge of climate change and the technical inputs for making decisions in terms of environmental policy. From that, she participated in the negotiator team in Colombia for 4 years, and she was part of the team from IPCC. She directs the Climate Dissemination Assets Initiative, Transforma. And we have finally Ivana Yaque. Ivana Yaque, you can come here. She is she manages legal matters and institutional matters in Aloxi. She has experience in different investment institutions like public-private associations and in the management of properties. She has studied in the Universidad de Lima in the SAN. She teaches at Continental University and in the National University for Public Administration. Now our panel is ready, and now please, Ana Maria. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to moderate this conversation today. And we hope to have the opportunity to get key messages from you, and so we expect to have that very active discussion. I would like this session is going to continue with conversations that we started yesterday. We're going to talk about instruments for mobilizing investments and financing for the to achieve climate goals. And I have two things to say about yesterday. Many interesting things were said, but when we looked at the position at Global Associate, I think that we were clear on the fact that the challenge is very big, and it's not challenge that can be faced by doing little projects here and there. It's a challenge that has to do with transforming development. And so it's a challenge that's much bigger than we think when we speak about project. It's a challenge that has to do with how do we transform things as a society globally. And something else that Elias said is that it's a challenge that's so big that we cannot face it without alliances. We cannot face it individually, separately. I think that we all know where we're going to, but we cannot do things separately. And so, since the practice community work, I'm not going to talk about this because Pablo will do it, but something that's very important for us is to discuss what are financial instruments that are being used in the region, but also how we're articulating private and public efforts so that the application of those instruments produces the targets that we have set. And so that's going to be today's discussion. We're going to talk about the instruments, but also about the articulation and what we need to strengthen. Okay, so I'm going to leave it to Pablo Rojas, who is also a member of the coordinating team at Articula, so that he can give us, so he can talk about objectives and context. Good morning, and thank you, Ana Maria.
Y Alexis también por leer tan cortas biografías de todas las personas.
Okay, first of all, I'm going to introduce myself for those that don't know me. My name is Pablo Rojas, as Alexis was saying, and I have been working with the Let's Like platform for quite some time, and today I work for the Euroclima program through German cooperation. And the first message that I wanted to give you is, well, hello from the program, and thank you for participating in this regional encounter, in this on-site event, because this is something that we needed. I am not going to go into much detail in terms of context, because before we had a session that was very exhaustive, because what Sandra and Raul said, it's very useful. We now know where we are at the region, what are the instruments that we have, and what are the needs and opportunities. But I did write some key messages that will help us open the session. They have to do with, although it's true that we see an improvement, we saw improvements in certain aspects and from information flows in the region, but we're still far away from the speed that we need to have and the ambition that we need to have. There are different figures and different diagnoses, but we say that from here to 2030, we need to multiply by 6 or 8 what we have been doing. And we not only need new investments, but also to channel or to relocate investment flows that exist. The investment flows cannot come only from the public sector. And as Elias said, well, the public-private alliances and articulations are more important, not only to achieve these relocations of investment flows, but also to transform development, which is what we have been saying repeatedly. Another thing that's clear as well is that climate funding has traditionally been focused on decarbonization, but now we know that the Latin American region is one of the most vulnerable ones regarding climate change. The agenda of adaptation and resiliency is a priority, and climate funding should also be able to reflect this political priority and this priority in the climate change management. And it's not the case right now. When we see the graphs and figures, climate funding is still focused on decarbonization, and we have to analyze the relevance of this. The Euroclima program, as many of you know, works at a national and regional level. At a national level, we work through country dialogues that we have with each of the member countries of the region. Today we have 33 countries in Euroclima from Latin America and the Caribbean, and we are in a constant dialogue with each of the countries, and very active dialogue with at least 4 or 5 countries that we are working with to determine strategic priorities. And climate funding is one of the constant elements. And in this program, we work through the implementation agencies, and we also look for synergies with other regional partners, IDB, CAF, etc. And so we work at a regional level. One of the ways of working at a regional level is through practice communities. And approximately 5 years ago, we started with a practice community where our coordinator is Ana Maria. We have a practice community between the private and the public sector in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is an initiative that started at Euroclima, but with the Let's Lag regional platform and with the support of NCAI Business School. So the 3 organizations have been working constantly, continuously. In this workshop, we have on-site participation of some of our members that have been participating before as panelists, and we have several members that are connecting, following us virtually, and we are sending them and we greet them. We have been working on different topics, private sector and how it interacts with the public sector and how they should interact. And we have designed a session where we're going to share the learnings, and we're going to moderate the discussion to what other colleagues can tell us. With this, I will be finishing. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pablo, for the space. We will not be having Pablo here on the stage. Thank you very much. So now we're going to present the context. Adrián is going to present the context. NDC partnership. It's a presentation on work that they have developed, the guide for planning and mobilization of investments for NDCs and other instruments of the climate policy. So, Adrián, I don't know if you want to do it from here or from there. Can you hear me? First of all, Ana Maria, thank you very much. Thanks everyone that Let's Like platform. It's a pleasure to be here and present the work that we're doing regarding investment planning, and especially our guide for investment planning. Just as an introduction, the NDC partnership, for those that don't know us, we're a coalition of countries, organizations at a global level. We work to implement, increase climate ambition, particularly NDCs, but also sustainable development goals. We have a technical secretariat that manages country requests, and we have a matchmaking role for the available resources. Okay, let me give you some context on the guide. I think that the panel that Raul led and Sanders' presentation were extraordinary I want to give you some context on what we want to achieve with the guide. I'm not going to go into detail, but I just want to tell you that the climate mobilization challenges are huge. It's a very high mountain to climb, and this is the case for adaptation, for finances. In developing countries, there is a gap, and we believe that this kind of tools, these guides for investment planning, are a very good way to attract funders and those who are close to the countries that need these resources. And I think that this is one of the recommendations that Sandra mentioned in her presentation. So that's one of the motivations with which we thought about the need of developing this guide.
Beyond thoughts at macro level, and we all know about that, internally at the NDC partnership, we see a need to develop a guide for investments. We do matchmaking. We receive country requests, and we did a deep analysis of the requests in the last years, and we saw how most were related with funding. And as from the last NDC updating, they got triggered, and it's evidently because the countries are not thinking so much in targets, but in implementation. In the finance category, they highlighted preparation of investment plans and projects, and what you mentioned, structuring. I can speak louder. Okay. Very well. Excuse me. And project preparation, but not necessarily, or not only projects for climate funds, but also for structuring investment. That's very clear. And we have this mandate of preparing all these knowledge products, courses, and tools that will allow country members and also our allies to work on this matter. This is how in February this year, after a year and a half of development, validation, and consultation, we launched a guide mainly aimed at decision makers at government level. It is a guide sufficiently flexible for other actors involved in this finance ecosystem to be able to use. Some elements in the guide. I'll refer to some foundations and not so much to structure. In an open space, we can talk about structure. We think that in investment planning, there can be no recipes. Each country has different conditions, capacities. They are at different stages of implementing their NDCs, etc. So it's a resource that countries can have access to depending on their capacities and take some elements that agree to their needs. Although some countries are using this guide as a blueprint for developing their investment plans, this is not necessarily the guide objective. The guide has enough resources for countries to take according to their needs. Another important element that is built upon a solid base of climate priorities, mainly NDCs. It can also be used in the context of NAPs and long-term strategies, LTS, or other policy instrument that has a climate rationality. So it's not only for NDCs, but we have seen there is appetite for using this guide in the context of implementing other instruments. An important element too, and this is related to what Ana Maria said about the global stock take and the future NDC updatings, is that we think that the planning process, as we promote it in this guide, should be dynamic and interactive. Planning investments has to do with parties' involvement, prioritization, identification of investments in sectors, and how this process is built as from the NDC and allows to give some continuity for NDC updatings. We think that planning investments can give way to more robust NDC with more blunt climate rationality, among other elements. An important trait for all is that with this guide, we want to combine a traditional approach in planning investment or a classic report based on projects with a programmatic approach. The classic or traditional approach is that you identify investment needs, you prioritize and develop projects that go to climate funds, and that's okay. But we also need to promote a programmatic approach which seeks true transformation, systemic change in the economy and the financial flows, everything that we have mentioned at budgetary level. We don't think that NDC investments have to be isolated projects or activities. They should be tied. And this is what we're trying to promote with this guide. This was a very important input given by private sectors and their partners. And we take this very seriously, and it's very much aligned to this panel about the different financial mechanisms and activities countries can develop in this regard. I won't get into too much detail about stages, but just to comment, the guide has 3 stages. First of all, capacity building. At this first stage, we want the countries to establish coordination frameworks, role definition mandates. Also, we want to see party involvement, not a passive or consultation involvement, a really active involvement regarding identification and prioritization of investments. We also lay the foundations for monitoring and reporting and feedback mechanism with the ONDC. The second stage, identification and prioritization of investment activities, NDC, NAB, long-term strategy. We identify, prioritize investments. And the last stage is investment mobilization. The idea is that as from prioritized investments, country analyze available resources, evaluate barriers to investments, establish measures, and match between resources available in projects. It can be through programs, budgetary measures, bonds, guarantees, swaps, many different mechanisms that we have today. And finally, and this is the guides, like the guide skeleton, 3 stages, 11 components, and a number of steps that would not be very didactic to share now, but we can go in depth afterwards. Just close by saying that we have resources that are the result of knowledge, and they are all available for you so that we can continue working together. As Elias mentioned, and then Ana Maria confirmed, there are many experiences in the region, and we don't need to invent the wheel. It's invented, and we just have to share what we know. I finish here, and thank you again for your attention. Excellent. Thank you very much. A big round of applause for Adrian. I'm going to ask Adrian to stay in the panel because I'm going to include him in the debate at the end. In the morning, we took a look at a number of instruments in the previous session. They are available for our countries to be able to mobilize funding to required investments. If we're thinking about transforming how we produce, how we consume, how we get organized, that definition of sustainable development, if we want to transform that, we need to channel funding towards public and private investments. We're going to have a round to talk about specific instruments as from the experience of organizations represented in the panel. I'd like to ask Caldo, first of all, from the IDB Invest experience, which is the private sector arm of the IDB. He will comment about two specific instruments, I understand, green credits and green bonds, and perhaps some others. So please comment about these specific instruments, what their characteristics are, and how they're being applied in the region. Thank you very much, Ana Maria and Let's Lack, for this invitation. It's very important to be able to coordinate private sector and public sector efforts to reach NDCs, achieve NDCs. I think the private sector does not have this in its permanent agenda. When we think about climate action, it's something that is already incorporated as a strategic priority in multinational company strategies. If you think about G, I think he said, it has a decarbonization rate for 2050, and that's the same rate for all countries where it operates. Or the BBVA Bank, they have climate action strategies that are motivated by their clients and their shareholders that demand more and more that all entities should have a positive action towards the environment. Now, how do we translate this into concrete products? In wholesaler bank, when we talk about project funding, it's green bonds and green loans, which are the most relevant, and they are funding related to projects that have a direct impact in the environment. We can talk about renewable generation plants or clean transportation or biodiversity or resilience to climate change. What's important is to have that they have a specific use and that we can monitor their impact, and that the targets, when qualified, will have been reached. Bygeo Iris does this kind of rating qualification. It's an instrument that validates that the developer and bank are fulfilling what the shareholders requested, and it's an important instrument to align the actions in these entities. With a Uruguayan bond, we saw that we could include benefits that result in lower financial costs. Commercial banking can also reach specific liquidity at lower costs for these ends. And finally, I'd like to comment another instrument we use from the multilateral banking, the blended finance, that complements commercial loans, assuming risks that the commercial bank won't assume. In Chile, for example, the first geothermal plant was done with combined funding. Bitinvest gave a loan. As you know, geothermal energy is very risky in the first stage. It's like drilling a first oil well. It can be dry, and then the capital is sunk in the ground. So it was really a disincentive to private investment. Now, what Bitinvest did was, with concessional funds, competitive funds, assume this fund, and if the well was not good, Enel would not assume it. It was the competitive fund that would assume it, and that facilitated the project. And they drilled, and it was okay, fortunately, and this generated the first geothermal project in Chile with a replicability potential. There are different instruments, not only green funds and green loans. The creativity of being able to assign risk to facilitate implementation of new technologies is very important, and combined financing has a role there. Thank you very much. It's okay now, right? Okay, thank you very much, Aldo. We're going to follow up what you said. Do we still have time? Are you taking account the 8 minutes? Okay. Then I'd like to ask Margarita. Transforma is part of this Lacadi initiative, and they have been doing work so that investment funds and institutional investors can contribute to getting or reaching our climate objectives. Margarita will then comment about this specific instrument and what they found in the work they did. Thank you very much, Ana Maria, Libélula, the Let's Lack platform for inviting us, and you for inviting us. We are based on a successful experience in Colombia called Lacadi, and we have worked with that also in Mexico and Peru. Then we're working with a regional view. The idea is to include risk and opportunities of climate change in the materiality of businesses, of institutional investors. Why is this relevant? Because the information and investment flows in all businesses and in the economy need to be aligned to be able to generate changes and transformations as we want. If we have projects, assets, and investments where we need to invest, and that will be part of the energy transition or transformation towards resilience, we need to know where that will come from the center of the economy and from the possible demands for investments with different investors. Post-Paris, the International Financial Council decided that the climate risk was so relevant for businesses, both physical, productive businesses and financial businesses, that we had to integrate them in the company's accounting and financial schemes, and they developed the TCFD recommendations, an ad hoc group that was incepted to do this. Such recommendations are based upon 4 pillars. One is how the companies manage their governance, how they include climate risks in their strategies, and also the opportunities generated by climate change. Also, risk management, because as we all know, risk is one of the most important elements to decide on private sector investments. Right now, climate risks have to start to be part of decision making and analysis, but it's not easy. We need lots of information and training to be able to integrate that. There's an objective, a pillar about objectives and metrics. Many of the first approaches of privates to private change had to do with counting emissions or small environmental responsibility projects. Okay, so the first thing was, how do you put metrics to these physical risks and the risks of transition of the economy to new low carbon possibilities that will bring changes in politics and businesses and will mean a new dynamic. So we want to impact the entire flow of information to improve transparency. Healthy economy is based on that. It has useful information for all, and that's why dissemination became very relevant. How will that how will that make investors change? We have worked on a self-assessment questionnaire with 20 investors between Mexico and Peru, and SICA is now working with 40 investors working in Colombia. Preliminary results in this analysis are that only 27% of all the investors are understanding and including climate change information in their materiality. Until it is not material for a company and affects its figures and businesses, they won't make decisions. What you see on the screen are the decisions that insurance companies, asset owners, or asset managers can take concerning changing their portfolios for low carbon and resilience. For that to change, they need information and they need to know what their country's priorities are and how they generate that information in their countries and countries in which they invest. Generally speaking, for Mexico and Peru, only 5 out of 22 institutions have periodical metrics and standards that will allow them to make strategic decisions. We have to stop measuring emissions just to measure them because of reputational impact, but measuring so that we know how our business has to change. Only 4 out of 22 have an established action plan. So these are incipient actions, and we need them to be more structural and be part of company corporate government. In this case, we evaluated only investors, but these guides and good practices of the LTCFD apply for all kinds of companies and will also be a way to manage climate change risk as an important factor for their businesses. Thank you very much.
Estamos viendo ahí brechas que son una gran
We see gaps there that are a big opportunity. We should take advantage to direct those funds there. Now, I'd like to ask Ivana, in this case, we have
una experiencia que Perú ha acumulado
an experience that Peru has accumulated in the scheme of works for taxes, and which is being promoted now and harnessed so as to contribute to comply with climate targets or goals. Ivana, please tell us how this scheme works and how you're applying this to NDCs, and then we'll see how the coordination goes about. Thank you, Ana Maria. Thank you for the invitation to the Let's LAC. The Peruvian government has different mechanisms to mobilize investments that provide infrastructure and public services in the country. One of these mechanisms is the so-called works for taxes. It's a public investment modality with the participation of the private sector. It was created in Peru 15 years ago. We are pioneers in creating this mechanism. It was created precisely so that the private sector could contribute with different regions and municipalities to make public investment that would attend people's demands and territorial demands in a more agile way. Private companies can advance up to 80% of their income tax to finance and execute public investments that have been prioritized by the government. This is how they contribute with closing gaps in the country. In exchange for this investment made by private companies with their own resources, they get certifications or certificates. These certificates have a certain value, and they will submit them to the tax entity as an advance for their tax payment. So this is how they help executing public investment while getting a reduction in their taxes. One of the benefits to highlight is that this mechanism mobilizes private financial resources, allows sharing knowledge, technology, innovation, and also incorporates resilience components and adaptation to climate change components in these investments. Another relevant aspect is that the private company can see their taxes go to tangible, specific investments that attend to the needs of the people and improve their quality of life. Added to that, it allows them to make their participation visible, and that contributes to their good relationship with society and improvement of their reputation. During the 15 years of this mechanism, we have had important experiences. More than 7 billion soles have been committed in more than 500 projects benefiting 21 million people. Out of these more than 500 projects, 50% have already been executed. They are finished. Among the interventions that can contribute to mitigating and adapting to climate change, we have such experiences in water treatment, solid waste, treatment plants, technified irrigation, improvement of irrigation canals, and the water and sanitation is the third that has invested the most with this mechanism. However, after 15 years, we want to go beyond that. This implies having a view of territorial development and incorporate these investments for natural infrastructure. And Aloxi has signed an alliance with Biofin from UNDP to generate knowledge on conservation and recovery of ecosystemic services and identifying and creating an investment portfolio in natural infrastructure. I would like to share a video about that, about how to implement the Works for Taxes mechanism in this sector. I can't hear it. No tengo sonido de ese video.
A través del mecanismo de obras.
Through the Works for Taxes mechanism, we have shown our commitment with the communities. The private sector, through the mechanism of Works for Taxes, has shown its commitment with communities, its stakeholders, and the countries. We have built schools, hospitals, and roads with this. Executing all these works has been, again, a great contribution to closing infrastructure gaps in our country. However, since Peru is a mega diverse country and it's very vulnerable to climate change, it needs investment projections in natural infrastructure to be able to enjoy these ecosystemic services. We need to invest in natural infrastructure. Along our territory, there are forests, rivers, lagoons that are at risk, more than 4 million hectares of degraded ecosystems, and more than 1,000 species of animals and plants that are threatened. It's urgent for the private sector to participate more actively in recovering and sustainably using these ecosystems that provide us environmental, social, and economic benefits such as food production, low carbon, conservation of biodiversity, power, water security, reducing natural risks, among others. Today, the companies, through this mechanism, have the opportunity to finance projects towards conserving and recovering ecosystems and using biodiversity sustainably. In this way, the mechanism of works for taxes is an excellent option for the public and private sector to work together to achieve this objective. Also, for the private sector, it contributes to improve their image and their relationship with local communities and stakeholders. Investing today in natural infrastructure is conserving ecosystems for the health and well-being of this and future generations. Let's do it together. ALOXI, Alliance of Works for Taxes.
Muchas gracias y felicitaciones por ese trabajo que están haciendo. Creo que para la sesión de en la tarde vamos a tener una
This afternoon, we will have a discussion on financing for nature and climate change, and this is a very good example. I would like, after listening to you on these different instruments, I would like to ask you to comment using 2 minutes each on how there are efforts of articulation between public and private sector to make sure these instruments contribute to the countries have adopted in terms of a climate. And this scheme shows this alignment, but I would also like to ask you, believe that you mentioned this, how do we do this? We have some projects with taxes for works. And how do you make sure that the other works also incorporate those resilience elements, low emissions? So please, I would like to ask Aldo, Margarita, and Ivana to tell us a little bit more about this. Yes, sure. So there's an effort from MINAM for development the green taxonomy. We are participating as IDB Invest, and I know that other commercial banks can participate. So it's a first forum where we can align a vision of what's a green project, and it can be aligned with the NDCs. That's a first step. And there are different initiatives in the IDB group to support NAMAs. There are two in particular that I would like to highlight. One is in clean transportation, where through COFIDE, funds are being channeled from IDB and concessional loans to have subordinate loans so that we can have more electric vehicles. And the other one is bio businesses. Through COFIDE, we're channeling funds and assistance for knowledge creation so that business people that have to do with these kinds of businesses can make it more sustainable without creating deforestation. Thank you. we bring three important points. First one is articulation and information. There is a very clear example for the region, how the Mexican Central Bank did a downscaling of climate change scenarios. For investors. It's very difficult to see a scenario with temperatures and precipitation and know what they have to do with their businesses. And so we have to translate it to indicators that are really associated to their business and their KPIs. This is a methodological exercise that's very important. And international consultants are doing a lot with this, making a lot of money with this. And now we have to, and climate change information has to be public. It has to help with decisions. We need to have joint models with different countries so that we can deliver them to investors and so that the money don't go into consulting, but in understanding the information and generate new instruments in those portfolios. The second one is obvious, and it's regulation. Regulation associated to dissemination is important. International Institute for Accounting Regulations just published basis. This is one of the barriers that we used to have. It's not yet mandatory in Latin American countries, and there's still some fear in investors to have this as mandatory. If we're in a discussion process between the public and the private, but some regulations do say that they have to include the imperative risks. Climate change is an imperative risk. So we wouldn't need to do a specific regulation, and now we have norms about ASG and ASG dissemination. So there are a lot of conversations. And so there's a very important element that's not as visible. In the end, in pension funds and in some insurance companies, the investments are done in bonds in the government, and understanding how that cycle works. And in the end, if we want to ask the investors for a sustainable investment, they don't say, I invest 40%, or in some cases, in 20% in government bonds. How sustainable are those bonds? Minister of Finances, what are you investing our nation's funds in? And so this is very important in the conversation, understanding that if the private parties do a dissemination, then the investors, how would that dissemination be affected if the governments don't disseminate in what they use the development resources? Thank you very much for the question. Climate change challenges demand from us to change the traditional ideas that we have on executing an infrastructure. We can have a natural infrastructure that contributes, but the other infrastructure that we have to execute to have needs must be oriented, must include components or foster sustainability. It must be resilient and adaptable to climate change. Private sector is aligned with these goals or with these targets. However, we must say that in works for taxes, a private sector executes public investment, and the rules of the game and the guidelines are established by the private sector. And so the public investment is executed in the framework of a public investment management system that's under the direction of the Ministry of Economy and Finances. And so we have to sensitize to create awareness in the public sector so that they incorporate these components as essential to contribute with climate change challenges. The Ministry of the Environment has the knowledge, local and regional governments have the resources, and so the multi-sectorial articulation and multi-level articulation is essential, is key to respond to these challenges, to face these challenges. Thank you very much. I think that we're been given a lot of inputs, and the committee of practice, we're going to start exchange activities focused on public-private articulation for mobilizing investments. And so here we have several cases that we can share with our members. Some of them are connected right now. To finish this segment and to make the tables work, I would like to ask you briefly to include Adrian in the work that you've done. We have seen cases, successful cases. We have seen opportunities that are not being used. And as a practice community at Let's Lack, believe that it's important to know what we need to strengthen. What do we need to strengthen so that these things that are done are replicated, extended, so that the opportunities that we are using are, so the opportunities that we have are used. So let's start by Ivana and let's finish with Adrian. I think that the generation and the strengthening of knowledge and capacities, as well as articulation, as well as multiplayer articulation, and the prioritization of resources and efforts are key pillars to make interventions concrete and then escalate them, interventions in terms of climate change. I think that that's key. And just to finish it at Aloxi, the Alliance of Works for Taxes, we ratify our commitment to continue boosting works for taxes to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Besides Lakai, we have had a very interesting experience, and we have created a discussion, conversation between financing people and climate change experts. The information flow is not that obvious. It's difficult to explain to the private parties that the indices are not only are theirs, and the information that's in there is what they need to develop their analysis and to know if climate change is going to affect their business or not. I think that this is a conversation that we still need to have. And the private, and now the private parties feel that, okay, now I have to work on climate change as well. For some people, it's in A, for others, in S, for others, it's in G. So how can we put these worlds together so that's a change, a transition? There's a change and transition. Of course, providing projects that are interesting, that are the right scale. At the beginning of the project, we started working with many investors, and they told us, my portfolio cannot change from one day to the other. We also need a great transition in Latin America, and we need to understand which are the good projects to go from 0 to 100 in terms of carbon neutrality, because we're not going to be able to do it in a risk level in terms of profitability. We need to have something slow where we can also have projects that really comply with the conditions that are needed. The private sector, what we have seen is that in the most relevant areas, evolution has been natural in Peru. An evolution led by the market, led by the decrease of the cost in solar panels, improvements in technology efficiency. And now we see that renewable projects are really the best for the system. And when we sign contracts, it's less than $30 for each megawatt hour. And this has no subsidies, no state intervention. What's important is acknowledging regulatory spaces to improve this transition. that the private sector is leading. In Peru, solar energies cannot sign PPAs because they are limited in terms of regulations. And there's a project in Congress to remediate this, and I think that there's consensus. That's the new hanging fruit, as we say in English. It's something that we can do, and I think that there's going to be a renewable boom when this is done. And I think that the government's role is to identify which are the most relevant sectors to reach these decarbonization targets. I'm thinking about transportation. Transportation is going to be very relevant. And if you're going to focus on transportation, we have to review transportation concessions and why they're not working at a metropolitan level. They have deficits and they have pretty serious problems. We cannot think about electrifying a bus fleet when the business itself has structural problems. First, we have to solve the concessions issues, and then we can electrify. I think that's the order we have to have. I think that that's where we're headed, starting with the green taxonomy. Thank you. And from the perspective of cooperation and this X-rays that we did with the request that we received, support requests about the programmatic approach. It must allow us to have multi-level dialogues that not only involve the private sector in validation, but having an active involvement that allows to prioritize, to get into investments, and that really creates an active involvement. And something that was mentioned is capacities, creating capacities to structure projects, creating, enabling environments. The taxonomy that you mentioned, transparency is also very relevant. And finally, it is also necessary to assess opportunities and to promote the mixed approaches and instruments to manage risk for the private sector. This is crucial for the private sector. As the IDB presentation mentioned, there are ways, and as I mentioned in my presentation, everything has been invented. We just have to share experiences. Thank you very much, and a big round of applause to our panel, for our panel. I think that it is now clear that things are happening. There are instruments that we need share experiences, share more what are the common challenges, and face them collaboratively. Have alliances, be aligned towards the objectives that we have. So many thanks, and now I would like to ask tables for some inputs. We have some questions for you. We have 4 questions. So please, can you join the tables? We have 4 questions, but not everyone is going to answer every question. We have 4 questions that are related with the discussion in this session. At your table, if you have a case, you can comment on it. What other instruments or cases or experiences do you know? What do we need to strengthen to increase and accelerate public and private investment flows that are necessary to comply with climate targets? And in your countries, how is public and private articulation happening to mobilize investments and reach climate targets. And also, please pay attention to this one. How are contributions, the private sector, being monitored for achieving climate goals? And Rocío mentioned yesterday that there were adaptation plans. There are things happening in the private sector, but how are they being acknowledged? How are they being measured? So let's ask, we ask you to have discussions in your tables, write your ideas into post-its. If in the discussion you see a key message that we should systematize, please write it down and post it, and then we will give you some indications, instructions. So while you are having a discussion, if you think that there's a key message, please write it down and just keep it there, okay? Okay, so how much time do we have? 15 minutes? Okay, 15 minutes for the discussion at the tables. Please, if there are a few people in the table, you have to please join another table so that the discussion is more lively.
Ay, perdón, ¿lo dije? No lo dije. Cada quien elige dos.
Each table has to choose 2 questions to discuss them.